Hi, my name is JJ Asghar, as I was introduced, and I'm a developer advocate for the IBM Cloud. And if you can find me on Twitter, at JJ Asghar there, or yes, I even have the email address of awesome@ibm.com. I'm here from Austin, Texas, and I lived and breathed the open source community since at least 2011, if not earlier. And these are some of the lessons learned of me cultivating and building open source communities. So the very first thing I want to start out with by saying that this is not a tools talk. Um, there's a huge possibility that or when you start looking at the DevOps culture and open source in general, you start looking at the tools. And this is not the tools. This is all the squishy stuff that we have to think about. Um, I might mention a couple tools here and there just to kind of keep the conversation going, but it's really about dealing with the humans of open source. Open source is challenging, and hopefully, with some of the lessons I've learned, if you're in this space at all, you will be able to take those lessons learned to be successful. So, the very first thing I want to bring up is why the reason it is the third slide here is scoping your project. The very first thing I learned when dealing in the open source world was how to scope your project correctly. I was really involved in an open source project called OpenStack for a very long time. And I truly and genuinely believe OpenStack basically became too big for its britches. It's an idiom meaning basically it was just too big for itself. And they built something called the Big Tent, where they allowed anyone who has uh, hit certain levels of understanding of the community to become an OpenStack project. Well, that was ripe for abuse and problems because we actually discovered you could build an OpenStack project within 45 minutes, and there were some companies out there that actually would give you bonuses if you started an OpenStack project at the time. So they scoped it so large to cover so many different things that it became unwieldy and just became ridiculous. So you really do need to take a moment. And when you're first looking into open source, make sure your project is scoped properly so you feel comfortable with it. I do also want to say that sometimes you can have large projects. One of the first open source projects I was ever part of was something called Crux Linux. And I was there where it was a BSD style ports tree on top of basic Linux tooling. And it was really neat. I got to become part of the FAQ team. I helped out on IRC down back in the time. And I even tested the ports trees. And yes, it was an operating system, but they scoped the project correctly to make sure that it actually helped out their audience at the time. Years later, I still have friends from that community where I do occasionally run into them, and it's funny to see that the project's still going strong, but because they scoped it properly and allowed it just to focus on one thing, they were able to be successful. So hopefully this gets the point across that scoping your project at any level is so important to be successful. So after you've taken a moment and scoped your project, you need to think about how you back your project. Now, there's two main buckets, and the first one I'm going to talk about is personally backed. So you've personally decided that I'm going to go ahead and do a project and put it out on GitHub and work on it and let the world help me work on it too. From what I've learned, this is the majority of projects out there. It really truly is. I mean, go to github.com. Anything out there is probably open source. Okay, we can talk about licensing later, but you get the point. But the largest challenge of being personally backed is that it's your baby, right? It's scratching your own itch. You have to become that leader of that project. And it becomes a double-edged sword because all of a sudden you are responsible fully for this project. I bet a handful of us right now are in this audience, have our own projects and all that, and think about all that responsibility that is on your shoulders about that. Like if you don't add something to it, and if you have a small community around it, you might have had to set some stuff up around and some infrastructure. And I'll get deeper into that later. Just take a moment and realize that personally backed projects really truly are a double-edged sword, where even though it's scratching that itch you still have all the baggage you need to come along with it. but it's important to know. And you are the end all be all, and it can be very, very stressful if you're not careful. On the other side of it, you have corporate backed projects, which I'm privileged, and I know this is a privilege. I keep raising my left hand. The camera's over here on the right, but I recognize that I'm very privileged to be able to work for corporately backed open source projects. It's a hard thing to get into, um, but at the same time, uh, it's not the same. It's Let me rephrase that. I understand that being in a corporately backed open source project comes with its benefits and its disadvantages. Um, the majority of people who I'm probably speaking to, you may have some open source projects with the different companies you're a part of, but having a corporate backed project also means that they are the responsible people for that project. Um, the challenges with corporate backed is that if you do start really falling in love with that project and start really working for it, you still can all of a sudden have it cut away from you. I always make a joke about Google Reader, right? Like Google, I loved Google Reader, and because it was a corporate backed, well, it wasn't open source, but it was a project from corporate from Google. They just took it away and it went out to pasture, as they say. Same as with Oracle eating up projects left and right. I mean, VirtualBox is a perfect example of that. Perfect example of that. It was an open source project for a very long time, and Oracle came along, bought up the rights to it, and it's taken a very different turn than it was when it wasn't an open source project. But the challenge again is that if the corporation backs your project, they ultimately have the decisions, and it's important to recognize that. So the next thing you need to understand is that you have to have empathy for your audience. So as you're working your way around into an open source project, you have to understand that when people come to you, you need to be able to put yourself in their shoes. Believe it or not, being a leader and a maintainer of an open source project, you're a performer and a seller all the time. You have to constantly be recruiting and always be on brand for your project. This doesn't happen overnight. It's just like a meetup. When we used to have meetups in the real world, you might have a meetup one month of doing something, and then the next month some less people show up, and it might come into a trickle. Same thing happens with open source projects. If you release something, you might have a bunch of people using it all of a sudden, and then 6 months later, you might have one or two people around. But then something else happens, and then you might get a bunch more. Or if you've honestly taken a wrong turn somewhere, you can completely lose all that good faith for your project very quickly. It takes months and months to build up a community for your project, and overnight it can completely disappear if you're not careful. Also, priorities change too wherever you go. So if you have a big company that comes in and says, "Hey, your open source project is really helping us out with something," they might throw a bunch of resources at you and get you doing some really neat stuff. I saw that um, I saw that really, really well with Chef and OpenStack, where I'd have massive companies come in and really help out our QuickBooks at the time. But then as soon as they got what they needed done, they disappeared. And I'd be stuck there like, okay, I've got all this stuff to support and I don't know what to do. It was hard. But I was empathetic to the people who came into the project, because honestly, they were they they got what they needed done, and then their responsibilities change, or their priorities change. So this is a quote that I came up with when I was staring out a window when I was looking at my old house, where it turns out an open source project is a lot like setting up a park cleanup, a trash cleanup. So I live in Austin, Texas, and it's very hot here. So I can't just go out and say, "Hey, I want to set up a this Saturday to do a trash pickup to pick up trash people left in the park." Turns out there's a lot of interesting logistics you've got to deal with it, because being Texas is hot, you have to be able to give people water to make sure they don't, fall over because they're a volunteer. You also need to be able to have trash pickups, and you have to set up logistics around it. Well, the challenge is an open source project is a lot like that. Especially if you're corporate backed, you have to sit there and you have to spend all this time and effort to work with the logistics inside of your company. But you don't realize with all that work that you're doing for that open source project, the people that are coming there to help you, in essence, pick up the trash, they're there to write code or produce something to help that project. They don't care about all the logistics you have to deal with as being a leader. And you need to understand that yes, you might have had to go on to 6 different status meetings or whatever to get approval to, do whatever for the project. Well, you might have a couple developers that come along, or doc writers, or just people testing your code who just want to help you with the picking up of the trash. So it's important to recognize these things and work for it. And work towards that. Now, if you want to read more about this little article I wrote, please ping me on Twitter, and I can go ahead and send you that link. But it really does highlight um, how open source projects and the logistics around it kind of come together. Next, then the thing we need to talk about are celebrations. We need to celebrate everything. If you are a leader of an open source project, you absolutely need to celebrate anything ranging from the newest release of your code to somebody put in their first commit to the first issue was resolved to somebody got promoted to a committer or have a commit bit now. Celebrations are absolutely important, and nothing is too small to celebrate. Take all and every wins you can, and you'd be amazed on how much of that positivity will draw people to your project. It's easy to say, but it's really, really hard to forget. And it's important to recognize that celebrations are absolutely important. But on the flip side, you also need to talk about your defeats. Defeats are very, very, very important. When something breaks or something goes off the rails, you have to own up to these things. You need to say that, yes, something went bad. You need to communicate this to your audience, because if you keep that stuff, or your developers or whoever's using your downstream open source project, because you never know, by you having a possible security bug or something like that with your project, you never know who downstream is using it, and that could have opened up them to a huge problem and risk. So you need to talk about your defeats. And at the same time, doing all this can be extremely draining and understanding. And Adam Jacob, who was the CTO of Chef, really did sum it up in a very straightforward tweet. And I've actually removed the tweet recently because there's some profanity in it. But the point being is that the defeats and the negativity that can come with the community when something goes wrong can be also very draining, and it needs to be recognized too as a leader. So I'm getting close to a little bit close to the end of this talk, because I recognize I have only 20 minutes here. But I do want to talk about some successful traits of open source projects. This one sounds obvious, but believe it or not, it's the hardest one to do. You have to trust, as an open source maintainer or creator of this project, you need to trust that people are going to do the right things. It is so hard to do. And you'd be amazed on how many people just throw code out there and don't trust anyone but themselves to change it. They only are the ones that can hit commit to it. By releasing your code into the wild, under the world, you need to trust on many hands make light work. You also need to be willing to work with other people and understand that inherently open source maintainers, open source developers, came to your project because it scratches one of their itches, right? That's the whole reason why they're there. They found something that does something they need. So of course they're going to invest their time into making it better. But of course they might take it a different direction. So you need to recognize that sometimes things kind of could go a different direction than you originally planned. The next thing is accessibility. This is a relatively contentious topic when we start talking about this modern day world that we live in now, especially with streaming and video conferencing and all. But one of the most important things I learned was when I was part of the OpenStack Chef project, is that I had a lot of people who worked out of China, and we were trying to use Google Meet to talk, to be able to like do our weekly syncs to make sure everything was going. But I didn't recognize at the time that Google Meet doesn't work in China. It just doesn't. So at the time we had to go back to IRC on Freenode before all the Freenode problems happened. but we actually used Freenode IRC to have asynchronous communications with all of these engineers in China. But I was able to get so much more diversity and diversity of just the ecosystem to be able to be so much more successful. Now, nowadays, a lot of projects use Slack, and that's considered okay, right? But it's still it's a walled garden, and that's a different conversation for a different time. But you have to, when you're empathizing with your audience and the people who are using, not only consuming but also helping you, you need to be sure to recognize accessibility and things that you assume are correct sometimes aren't. Next, you need to have a clear vision, and the clear vision is more in turn. You've got to you have to have a plan to move ahead. So believe it or not, the open source project that you're thinking about starting is not going to be your open source project for the rest of your life. It's just true, right? Like whoever thinks they're going to start an open source project and that's the only thing they're going to do for the rest of their life is frankly delusional, right? It just doesn't happen that way. I've started multiple open source projects myself. Again, I lifted my left hand, I'm supposed to put my right. And it's really important to know that you need to, if you have a clear vision with an open source project, you can hand it off to someone else. You'll eventually get bored and you'll need to find something new. And if you have that clear vision, whoever decides to take up those reins of that open source project will do what you need to do. As a developer or an engineer, you have the trait to be a constant learner. Your project will go stale and crusty and possibly even a burden. Some say this is when others can become jaded and decide to move on from this. You need someone who can take up those reins, and also you need an exit strategy. And with a clear vision, you'll have those things. And who knows, when you decide to move on to your next project, I've had friends who I still know from previous open source projects that are curious about what I'm working on now and want to come along with me to the next thing. Or for that matter, you may follow someone else because you met someone that during this process and you get a new challenge. It's important to recognize these things. So my final question here is honestly, starting an open source project, is it even really worth the hassle? And with who I'm speaking to, and if you came to this talk and actually are listening to it, there's probably some level of debate into your head because you probably have thought of some open source project that you wanted to start or be involved in. And you start seeing all the things around it. And it's not just writing code, right? Like people think open source is just writing code, throwing it up on GitHub, and maybe starting a wiki, and the masses will come and help you. It's not. There's a lot of logistical work you've got to do around it. There's a lot of investment and time you've got to put into it. There's the danger of you wrapping yourself, part of your personality up into it too, which happens. And I mean, I've had it happen to myself. That you need to think about it. And also, can you spend the time to do it? Is a really important question. You need to balance those demands of the users that have little to no thanks that come to you, that basically drain you for help. It's really challenging, and it's important to know. So my answer to this question is simply, it depends, right? Like that's what it does. It really depends on if you're willing to step through that ecosystem and walk through it. I know for a fact that myself, I believe it is myself worth it, but for you, it may not be. And hopefully, I've highlighted some of the things that you may have not thought about or might want to look towards in the future. So I want to say thank you. And please find me on Twitter at JJ or email me seriously at awesome.com or awesome@ibm.com. And that QR code is actually a link to a Google form where there's 4 questions on it about my speaking style and how I do it. It's only for me. And I really do try to make myself better. I try to continually learn. And I would love some feedback there. Again, it only comes to me, and it's not associated with IBM or anyone. It's just to me, and I would love for your honest feedback. Thank you so much.